We have a fabulous group of folks here with us today, and I am going to quickly run through introductions, and then we're going to have a very fast-paced and hopefully engaging session for all of you. Most of the folks here on this panel are members of the U.S. Energy Security Council, which you heard about earlier this morning, the highest level extra-governmental group ever assembled to address the energy security challenge, comprised of some 30 individuals, former cabinet members, senators, governors, leaders of industry, and so forth. So, without further ado, let me just run quickly through the introductions and then we'll get started. Senator Bennett Johnston represented Louisiana, not to mention was chair of the Senate Energy Committee, and he's really a true expert on all these issues and has a lot to say about methanol. Bud McFarlane is president of IGS. He is actually co-founder of the U.S. Energy Security Council, and he was National Security Advisor under President Reagan, not to mention many other roles in government. Marty Toomadjian is president of the Energy and Environment Group at Battelle. Boyden Gray advised President Bush Sr.
41.
Bush 41. Was ambassador to the European Union, and many of you may remember that the last time around he was really a major driver and push behind the methanol program in the administration. Vic Rao was CTO of Halliburton. Don't you love it when I introduce you that way? And is executive director of the Research Triangle Energy Consortium. And I'll talk about your book a little bit later, not to worry.
Right, thank you.
Yes. Donna Riddell was managing director of the World Economic Forum and chair of the Commodity Exchange. Dr. Surya Prakash, you've heard about already, a very famous winner of the first inaugural Fuel Choices Prize, runs the Loper Hydrocarbon Institute over at USC. John Hofmeister, former president of Shell Oil, and obviously an expert on the oil and gas industry. So let's get started. John, we're going to start with you. You know, Shell recently made an announcement that it's not so sanguine about its shale holdings in the U.S. Everybody's so optimistic about shale gas. We hear John Boehner talking about the U.S. is going to export lots of gas. But here we have Shell cutting down staff, cutting down its investments. What's going on? Shale, boom or bust?
Well, I think shale is here, and to call it a revolution, I think, is still a safe word. But I don't think shale has ever been presented, other than by extreme enthusiasts, as nirvana for America, for a number of reasons. This is a big country. It's a big market. My former company, I do not speak for them any longer, but they have a capital ranking program that they put all their projects through, and they only fund the best. And so when they get to, if they're going to sell some shale assets, it says they didn't rank high enough with the other opportunities that they face. But in addition, all the majors were a bit late to the shale, and whether it's Exxon or Chevron or BP or Shell, they're all a bit late to the shale. And of course, the sweet spots go first. And so, you know, I think you can explain it in a variety of ways. But the key point I would make, and I've been making for years, is that while we have a newfound abundance of domestic natural resources, in particular natural gas, this is not in and of itself the solution for energy independence or national energy security in this country. There's a lot more needs to go into it than just the shale plays, so to speak. There needs to be a coordinated, coherent plan that looks at all of the sources of energy. I think that that's energy as it relates to power generation. There also needs to be a coherent, consistent plan put together to deal with transportation fuel. The bad news is we have a plan for neither. We never have had, and the prospect in the near term of having a plan for our power generation future and our transportation fuels future is frankly non-existent, other than groups like the National Energy Security Council, Fuel Freedom Foundation, Citizens for Affordable Energy, and a lot of other organizations that care deeply about this on behalf of the nation's national security and on behalf of the nation's energy security. I think we've all been reminded in recent days that national security has to be on the agenda with what we're seeing playing out in the Ukraine and what we've seen take place in Venezuela and what we've seen take place in Libya and what we've seen take place in Syria and on, because the oil-producing nations of the 20th century are not going to take care of the 21st century. In fact, I'm still on the record as saying I believe we will have oil shortages in the second half of this decade. Not the second half of this century, the second half of this decade, because of the whole range of geopolitical issues. We've seen the major oil companies spend billions and billions of dollars, higher than ever in their history, for almost no growth. We don't see growth in OPEC oil, and we see tremendous growth in the developing world for demand for oil products that exceeds any decline in oil demand in OECD countries. And so you just do the simple math, and by 2016, 2018, we're going to be short crude oil. So why would the world's largest economy expose itself to the eventual shortage of crude oil without putting together a plan to do something about transportation fuels when mobility is perhaps the biggest industry in the country? Whether that's mobility by air, mobility by ship, but mostly mobility by truck and by personal car, we don't know where we are and we don't know where we're going. And that's where the group here and the others we heard from this morning really need to be listened to. They have something to say. There are a variety of alternative fuel choices if we made decisions. But it'd be a shame if we end up in gasoline lines because of the shortage of crude oil, wondering, well, why did we waste the first half of this decade not doing something about it? I'll leave it there.
Thanks, John. Vic, you know, you kind of wrote the short little Bible on shale gas, The Promise and the Peril. Highly, highly recommended little book. Where are you on this?
Well, where I am is respectfully disagreeing with John, who knows more about this stuff than I do, but I will respectfully disagree regarding the shortage of oil in the future. I really believe that if shale gas is for real, and it almost certainly is, that as long as OPEC is still standing, the arbitrage opportunity between gas and oil is going to be so high that natural gas will replace oil for almost everything we do, whether it's ethylene, propylene, diesel, gasoline, name it. When that happens, the demand for oil has to come down. And then in addition, this country and others are going very strongly toward more energy efficient vehicles, smaller vehicles in India and so forth. So my future is really much more bullish with respect to destruction of demand for oil and thereby reducing it to a useful, not a strategic commodity.
Well, you're not actually disagreeing. You're not actually disagreeing with John. You're just saying we're going to cut off disaster at the pass by doing the smart things in time.
I completely agree with him for the need for a plan, without doubt. We don't have one. But I don't think there will be a demand problem. I don't think there'll be a supply problem in the second half of the decade. Well, I'm not sure about the second half of the decade, but out in 2025, I see a significant reduction in demand for oil due to this arbitrage. If gas stays abundant, and if the gap is there due to OPEC controlling prices.
I'm going to go over to you, Donna. You know, you chaired the commodity exchange. What we're talking here essentially is introducing arbitrage among energy commodities.
Well, you're also talking about supply and demand. So whenever you have abundant supply and the demand is lower than the supply, the price will fall. And so if you can get this gas out in the marketplace, and it is cheaper than, and is more available in the areas for the cars and the trucks, and then you will find people switching over because Their pocketbooks are going to talk, and the supply will be there, and they won't be fearful of not having gasoline in the normal way in which they had. And I think you see some of it in people's interest, not only in natural gas, but with the Tesla. I mean, if you didn't buy a car and you just bought the stock, you're seeing what people's expectations of the future are, and you might be able to afford a car now if you bought enough stock. So I think you see in the marketplace expectations that things will change. Exactly how they're going to change is whether or not there's a plan and it gets coordinated together.
Now, Senator Johnson, we hear a lot of talk about gas. And one thing that's really neglected is kind of the workhorse of the U.S. energy sector, which for years, much maligned, but just steady on doing the work, has been coal. How do you place coal in this context?
Well, coal, of course, is a feedstock for methanol. I mean, we're about methanol here, so we know that coal is a feedstock. But I'd like to pose a basic question, which is, if methanol is so good, why don't we see it in the United States? I submit that in order for methanol fuels, for alternative fuels to catch hold, they need to be certified and tested and standardized by the Department of Energy or by some branch of the government. Now, you know, back in 1987, DOE had a test for methanol, and it was very successful, except that the price of crude oil went down to almost $10 back in 1987, and then it became sort of, what's the point? So they gave up on that endeavor. Now, our friends the Chinese, as Kai Zhao was talking about this morning, have a very extensive program for methanol. If you look in the back of your program, you'll see all the places in China that are using all the different fuels, M15, M30, M25, M5, M100. They have a very extensive program. Now, I submit that the United States, at the Department of Energy, ought to make common cause with the Chinese. I think we've got a lot to give them in helping design automobile engines and determine what the most efficient engines are. I think that you've got a test, or somebody this morning made a question about toxicity of methanol. I think the answer is it is not really more toxic than gasoline, but that needs to be certified by someone. You need to determine where the best efficiencies are. Is it with M15 and gasoline? Is it M30 with diesel fuels? And I think the Chinese are very successful with that. What are the tailpipe emissions? Are there any poisons to come out? That needs to be certified. I believe if we made common cause with the Chinese, we could help one another a great deal and come out with some standardized and certified products. You know, today you really can't sell E15 because the car companies say it would violate their warranty. So in order to have these different methanol fuels or ethanol fuels, they need to be tested and certified by the Department of Energy. We've talked to Secretary Moniz about this issue, and I think he has an interest. And I want to catch Kai Zhao later this afternoon and talk about this, because I think we've got a lot to do together.
Thank you, Senator. Now, in addition to meeting Ernie Moniz a few weeks back, some members of this group also met with EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy going back some months. And this is a great point to jump over to Boyden, because Boyden, you were so involved with this last time around, the kind of the resurgence of methanol in the 90s. And as Bennett says, the price of oil dropped and it kind of pulled the ground out from beneath that effort. How do you see this time hopefully being, do you see it as being different? Do you see a happier ending potentially here? What needs to happen?
I'm a little bit pessimistic. I don't want to throw cold water on what Senator Johnson just said, but he, in a way, was reflecting his own committee jurisdiction. The agency which does the certification is EPA, not DOE. And EPA asked recently for comment on the certification of a mid-level alcohol blend, and then they rejected it out of hand after the comments came in that were very favorable. So I don't know what to do about EPA. They ask for comment, they get favorable comment, a flood, and then they dismiss it as though it had never happened. So I'm a little bit discouraged, and I hope that Gina McCarthy, now that she's head of the agency, first head of EPA ever to come out of the Air Division, which decides all this, that maybe that will recommend a change. There's one small point I want to make about the shale gas revolution, which is that I don't think it's enough to have it just in the United States where it started and where it's booming. The difference between us in the United States and the rest of the world, including China, is that we're about the only country where the landowner owns the mineral rights. And that's a big incentive to let all this ruckus take place on your farm or in your backyard if you're getting a check. But if the state's getting a check and you're not getting a check, you're not so enthusiastic about it. So that needs to be carefully looked at. And in addition, in China, where most of the shale is, I'm told, there's not much water. So there are other ways of doing fracking, but that has to be watched. But I just want to put in a word of caution that the property rights regime has a lot to do with the future of gas and methanol from gas.
You know, at this point, I want to jump over to you, Bud, and I want to kind of refocus on the price of oil. There are two schools of thought. One is saying, look at what's happening over with Iran. Look at what's happening in Europe with Russia. Look at what's happening in Venezuela. The price of oil is going to go up. Another is saying, well, look, Iraqi oil production is increasing. The U.S. is having this oil boomlet. We're going to have peace and love and kumbaya with Iran and get, you know, all that oil on the market. Oil price is going to go down. Where are you on this? Where do you see the price of oil going? Because obviously that sets the context for...
Well, Ann, I think John Hofmeister, who spent his life in this industry, is best qualified of anybody in this room to say, when you look at the demographics, which means demand for oil, which is the only transportation fuel, let's face it, the demographics of China and India alone will increase demand by more than 10 million barrels per day in about the next 7 to 10 years. Well, you can say, well, there's Bakken, there's offshore, Anwar, the Gulf. There's all these other places producing oil. However, they cannot pretend to reach that big a delta in the run-up in demand for oil. In addition, the OPEC countries, for that matter, have not been reinvesting sufficiently into new capacity to be able to meet that much increase in that amount of time. And moreover, we've seen from the Arab Spring that while their personal interests really are in higher prices of oil, they don't want to see in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states what has happened in Libya and Tunisia and Syria, elsewhere. And so their solution is, let's raise salaries at home to try to keep the lid on and avoid rebellion in each of those countries. Well, when you raise outlays for government salaries, you've got to have more revenues. So they like high prices. So prices are bound to stay higher because the people that own 72% of all the oil reserves in the earth have an interest in higher prices. We have an opportunity to produce a lot more in this country. So it isn't a matter that we are going to run out of it. It's simply that it's going to be priced by a cartel whose interest is in high prices. There's going to be high prices. There really can't be a serious debate about that. It's in the interest of the producers. They own most of it, and they're in a position to set it wherever they want it. We should be delighted that we have all this new production of oil and gas. It's terrific. But the price of that oil is still going to be set in Vienna every 6 months. Nothing we can do about that. We can never outproduce sufficiently to drive price down to where we want it. They simply stop. And that will drive the price back up again. So the price of oil is going to go up. It's like taxes. That's just the nature of humankind. But the blessing is that there are alternatives, and you've heard from this morning's guests that the alternatives are real. The Energy Security Council was formed out of fear, panic, that this high-price regime is going to happen, but then to raise awareness that the alternatives are there. We don't care who wins it. Electricity, fuel cells, methanol, ethanol, whatever it is, just have an open marketplace is our mantra. We can do it. The trouble is it takes leadership. And just nobody is leading on this issue that has the access to media and so forth to really get it done. This is a time for a bully pulpit to really be used and point out that there's a big problem, a big freight train headed our way. But yes, there is a solution. And everybody in this room knows what it is: competition.
Thanks, Bud. So fiscal break-even price for OPEC countries, price required to balance their budget, is going up and up and up, but we can deal with this. We can protect ourselves. The world can protect itself through competition in the transportation fuel market. Marty, how important is innovation in this process?
Innovation in this process is critical. I was almost going to say several decades ago, but it's not quite that long. When I was in graduate school, I was doing work on coal gasification and coal to liquids. Back then, the price of oil was about $20 a barrel, and everyone kept saying, if it just gets to $40 a barrel, this process will now be economical. Well, we're long past that. Every time the price of oil goes up, the price of alternatives goes up, but we've got to continue doing research in these alternatives, or else the price of oil will never come down. So we need to have innovation, we need to have funding in innovation, and we need to make sure that we continue to drive that innovation through the valleys of the funding, because the price of oil, as Bud said, is going to go up and up and up. These new processes and these new technologies we have coming on board, the price is going to come down. As methanol becomes more used in the United States, the price of methanol will come down at the pump. Probably the biggest innovation we need right now is in infrastructure and in regulatory reform. Infrastructure is the key to this. Back when Ford developed flex fuel cars several decades ago, they could not get traction in the United States because there was no infrastructure for methanol in the transportation fuel system. Brazil came to them. They said, let's do it down in Brazil, do it with ethanol. Flex fuel vehicles moved on to ethanol versus methanol. There's no reason why flex fuel vehicles today cannot be formed on methanol.
Bud, did you want to jump in before I go over to Surya?
Well, all of us are familiar with the chicken and the egg problem. You've got to have a marketplace before people will invest in ramping up these alternative fuels. The marketplace comes from Detroit. Detroit, however, is on board. In my judgment, and Boyden and I had a meeting with the chairman of Ford here last year, he termed himself an automotive Bolshevik, and he said, my great-grandfather told me that our entire industry ought to be running on alcohol, and I believe it. But where's the fuel? Well, that's the chicken-egg other side of it. We've got to get the enabling legislation that Senator Johnson explained here a moment ago, or people aren't going to invest, and the automobile makers are not going to warranty until the EPA says, yes, mid-level blends or any blend work, and then the investment will come to get it done. But right here in Washington is the next place to get something done.
Innovation in Washington will drive innovation elsewhere. Oh boy.
That's a challenge.
Surya. Innovation.
Innovation. Actually, we didn't talk in this forum. The big elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about is anthropogenic CO2 emissions. In fact, the adoption of the methanol economy, we believe, will give segue to renewable methanol, which you could make it from recycled carbon dioxide. This will free mankind. We can use carbon-based fuels into eternity as long as sun is alive. Sun is going to be there for next 4.5 billion years. And we have plenty of energy on Earth, but we don't know how to store this energy. And we have the energy carrier problems. And fossil fuels, if you really think about it, it is nothing but fossilized sunshine. It all came from sun. If you understand that, we can store wind energy, solar energy, hydro, all kinds of alternative energies. We can make methanol from CO2. In fact, this experiment is happening in a company called CRI in Iceland, Carbon Recycling International, which Methanex has taken interest and made some investments, and they're making renewable methanol. So the adoption of methanol economy, these ideas as transportation fuels and feedstock, using abundant shale gas in the United States or coal in China or non-edible biomass in India, we can really go to renewable fuels in the future. So this methanol economy is not just using whatever we have in terms of fossil fuel resources. It's a long-term solution to mankind.
Vic, big, beautiful lab over at the Research Triangle. What are you excited about in terms of innovation?
Well, let me build on what Suri just said. Any process that we now have to convert methane into into liquids, the back end of the process is exactly the same if you use biomass to start with it. So that's the interesting point, that if you build an industry which displaces oil to some degree, using plentiful methane at this time, and let's say the price of methane does go up, then at some point biomass kicks in. Because this is this beautiful thing about the chemical engineering process, the back end is exactly the same. Once you go through what's called syngas, everything else is exactly the same process. So the industry will be set up to where it can use alternative sources, whether it's biomethane or biomass conversion, etc.
John, the oil majors, if we think about Shell, BP, Exxon, and so forth, they're not able to explore and lift, let's say over in Saudi Arabia where it's cheapest to explore and lift. Aramco doesn't need them. In many cases, they're not able to replace their oil reserves with oil. Some of them have big gas plays. We heard about a little bit of ambiguity about the gas situation. We talked about that earlier. But which way should they bet? They have a distribution chain. They have a competitive advantage there. Which way should they bet?
Well, the thing that people need to understand about oil and gas industry is they are primarily producers. Their job is to produce. They're very good at it. They're not into the markets that they serve other than a byproduct of their production, which inside the industry they basically call offtake. The offtake goes to a retail market. They will produce what they know how to produce. They will do it safely. They will do it with incredible technology. And they will do it to make sure that oil remains affordable because they want to produce as much as they can produce. So where are they going to go? They're going to go wherever they can produce. They will do deals with Saudi Aramco. They will do deals with PDVSA. They will do deals with Gazprom. They will do deals with anybody. But what they would like to do is know where, with some certainty, the world is going in the range of fuels that are out there. Because when they make a bet, it is a multi-billion-dollar bet. And you don't want these to go wrong. I can remember testifying 6 times in 18 months between 2006 and 2008 over the price of gasoline when there was a simple request from all of the witnesses that we could address the price of gasoline if you would just let us produce. This was during the Bush years. Just let us produce. And the answer was no change. Here we are, all these years later, and the industry is still making the same request. Just let us produce. We produce oil, we produce gas. You can do whatever you want with that oil and gas. Our job is to produce it. But here we sit, and I'll go back to the point I made earlier. We have had excellent people chairing the Energy Committee the House Energy and Commerce Committee, over the years, we've had Democratic leadership, we've had Republican leadership. But it seems like we live on a 2-year cycle. And the 2-year cycle is not long enough to really penetrate the difficult issues that have to be resolved here. And so the oil and gas industry understands that. They continually present the same face, the same messages, the same requests over and over, but every 2 years, it's another agenda. We had Ron Wyden. Now we have Mary Landrieu. We have Fred Upton. And what do we have in November? We don't know yet. And so that constant churn, I think, presents a real problem for the energy industry in general. Let me just say this and I'll finish. Janet Yellen is sitting down today and tomorrow to run the Federal Reserve the way the monetary system needs it to be run. Why don't we have an equivalent body that does the same for energy? With all due respect to the Congress and with all due respect to every president since Richard Nixon, we don't know where we're going on energy any better today than we did in 1973. Why don't we have an equivalent of Janet Yellen meeting with a group of expert, knowledgeable people who have one thing in interest, and it's not an election. What they're interested in is how to solve the problem, how to deal with the monetary future. Well, we need that same kind of an independent body to deal with our energy future.
But before I jump over back to Senator Johnson, and I want to focus on Louisiana, I want to draw out one more thing from your comments. How, you know, the kind of the shift in terms of their reserve blend from mostly oil, shifting more and more and more gradually towards gas. The pulling out of the refinery business that we saw over the past decade by some of the majors. Because the refiners don't really love methanol. You know, it's competing with them at the end product level, right? Competing with them over the fuel tank. And they need to have pretty high utilization in order to be profitable. Is this shifting thinking at all in terms of the oil industry becoming more, as you said, oil and gas industry? Is this going to shift their thinking about methanol?
Well, you do the financial analysis all the time of what makes sense for shareholders if you're a publicly listed company. And right now there is not a lot of enthusiasm around methanol or natural gas because the price is so low. One of the reasons they're advocating exports is to get the price up. Get the price up and you'll see more natural gas produced. Today, we have about 1,700 drilling rigs drilling just in the US. Only about 200 are natural gas rigs, which says about 1,450, 1,500 are oil rigs because the money's in oil. The money's not in natural gas. And at $4.50, which is about where natural gas is today, it's not going to put more rigs to work. And so the natural gas prices got to rise for them to take more interest in it. But as the natural gas price rises, what does that do to the methanol price? And will the methanol price be sufficiently less than the oil price to make methanol a profitable product? Anything we're talking about here is going to come back to the bottom line. Can you make money doing it? Now, I believe you can if you had a plan for how much. The reason the methanol price is going to go up is there's not enough methanol manufacturing. And so it's risen recently. Well, let's have more methanol manufacturing. We would have more methanol manufacturing, and some of these very same companies, Shell, Chevron, Exxon, et cetera, could very well build methanol plants if they knew where the market was going, because certainly they have the natural gas in reserves. So how do you get it out of reserves and into production? You need price points, and those price points come from knowing where the market's going. But if you don't know because you have no plan, you're never going to get there.
Thank you. Now, Senator Johnston, let's focus on Louisiana for a moment. It's a very interesting state from an oil and gas perspective. You see a very large refining presence there, but we're also seeing something like 7 methanol plants in the works. Chair of the Energy Committee now, Mary Landrieu, also from Louisiana. So obviously the politics of energy in Louisiana will have a profound impact on the politics of the nation when looking at these issues. And there's this push-pull between the refining industry not really loving, as we were just talking about, not really loving competition from other fuels. How does this play out?
Well, in Louisiana, you know, they discussed that Methanex plant this morning. What are they using? Natural gas, which we drill a lot of in Louisiana. So we're all for methanol and natural gas and oil in Louisiana and throughout the producing community. And after all, methanol is very good when combined with gasoline. The racers were talking this morning about how it reduces the cylinder temperature. You can have higher pressures and greater efficiencies. That's one of the things we can help with the Chinese, I think, by designing more efficient industries which will reduce global warming, reduce CO2. That's why I think that that even with EPA, Boyden, I think we can convince them that methanol is very good for reducing CO2 overall because it gives you more efficient combustion.
Mm-hmm. Politics. I want to focus in on politics. You want to jump in here for a moment?
I want to jump in quickly and point out, you said refiners don't like methanol. Surprisingly, refiners are not liking our shale oil because
Too clean.
It's too clean. It's too sweet and it's too nice. So right now there's a discount. Last time I looked in January, North Dakota Oil was selling for an $18 discount to WTI and about a $30 discount to Brent. This is absurd. So therefore, I'm going to give you a policy position. We should be allowed to export oil because I wonder what will happen to our GDP if we exported 2 million barrels of light oil at market prices and, oh, by the way, imported 2 million barrels of Canadian oil at a discount of $20 a barrel. I think we'd do much better. So I think we need to take a hard look at allowing a certain amount of export. We currently are allowed to export refined goods. We export 3.5 million barrels a day of refined goods. Why shouldn't we be allowed to export oil?
You're saying trade is good, more trade is better.
Sell high, buy low. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, politics, Bud, and then over to you, Boyden. Are you optimistic? Are we going to get movement? Are we just hearing all of the above kind of talking points from the administration with nothing behind it? Or is there, you know, after talking to Ernie Moniz, after meeting with Gina McCarthy, do you see more of a desire?
Well, there are countervailing forces. I think politically right now we are at one level, at Gina McCarthy level and at Secretary Moniz. We have a real opportunity here because both are advocates of introducing alternatives. They believe in, they work, they know. Secretary Moniz produced this landmark study with Senator Johnston's help about how to use natural gas, and it's methanol. So, gosh, you've got a cabinet officer well disposed toward it. You've got the head of EPA so inclined, similarly. And there are sister organizations to our own here that are engaged in encouraging that to be translated into policy. At the end of the day, the most compelling argument, though, is price. I believe, as everyone on this morning's panels have alleged, that consumers are driven by price. And if we can make visible a better case that methanol is cheaper, and by the way, better, cleaner, and so forth, then the consumers will call for it. It would help a lot if we had leadership from the very top. And so far, in my judgment, that hasn't been forceful. But hope springs eternal. At the end of the day, though, I'm afraid it's going to take something violent for this to get done. Something violent that puts oil at about $200 a barrel, and I'm sorry to say that I think that's likely to happen.
Donna, do you want to jump in?
I want to follow up on the consumer because I was thinking about I'm glad you brought it up, the group that one hasn't been in the conversation, which is this level of conversation for them needs to be, they need to get a storyline. They need to understand the components of what we're talking about, because they seem to have become, a little bit complacent on the price of oil. It's been the $100 range for quite some time, and you haven't seen a lot of consumer activism. But the clean air, a story that they can buy into and become vocal about would be very, very helpful, because in many other industries, the consumer has changed the way in which the company, the government, and globally, they think about products. So I do think that the consumer, if they could understand and we could unbundle some of the conversation for them into a way that they can be our advocates, would be very helpful.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, you think back a little bit over a decade ago when oil was going up from $25 to $35 a barrel and prices at the pump were increasing just that little bit. Consumers were screaming bloody murder. And right now it's like consumers have just been stunned into silence. They just are used to this a new normal.
Right.
New normal. Boyden, politics. Do you see a little glimpse of reason to be optimistic? Are we going to have to wait for the next session of Congress, the next administration, or is there a chance to get something moving?
Well, there's one point which I think needs to be emphasized, which is, and I hope Bud's wrong, that it's not going to take $200 a barrel to do this. I hope you're wrong about that. But I do think that politically coalition building needs to precede political action. And I don't see too many representatives of the transportation sector here, whether it's cars, trucks, buses.
We're actually quite a few auto industry folks in the room.
But I think they're critical to this. I mean, railroads, aircraft, ships. I think the whole transportation sector needs to be united. And I think if that happens with consumer groups who can be organized by the people who sell directly to the consumer, like car company, then I think the politics will have to follow, hopefully long before $200 oil.
I'm with you. I just worried.
Marty.
Yeah, we talked about price, we talked about markets, and we talked about what's happening in the whole industry. But I think the reality still comes back to if there's a market out there, someone will fill the void and someone will manufacture it. So we need to make sure that methanol, any alternative fuel, has a market and gets out to the consumers so the consumers can purchase it. And then if someone's purchasing it, that will help drive the price. As the price comes down, innovation will step in, and that will then reset the industry, and they'll be able to meet that price. Before John left, he mentioned about natural gas having to get much higher than $4 per million BTUs. That was the price break for essentially the natural gas drillers to be economical. We saw a lot of activity in the Marcellus Shale last year pretty much stopped, other than drilling wells in order to hold leases. Drillers innovated. They got to the point where they can now manufacture and they can now drill much cheaper. And now their price point is around $2.50 per million BTUs. So we started seeing drilling activity starting to speed up and move up coming into this calendar year. With the price of natural gas even up at $4.50 per million BTUs where it is today, that will drive a lot more exploration. Now obviously that will then drive prices again, but it comes down to getting that market going. Whether we need regulatory reform or we need consumer activism, we've got to get the market for alternative fuels going, and then industry will meet it.
Senator Johnson mentioned China a couple times, and I want to kind of pick up on the China theme. If we think the U.S., Brazil, China together in terms of vehicle manufacturing, vehicle demand, we're talking about at least half of the global market. And so if you get these big behemoths moving forward in terms of opening their cars to competition, obviously that's going to have a huge impact on the rest of the world. How can we collaborate better with China on these issues? Anyone want to jump in? Sorry, I'm going to pick on you. On the scientific level.
China makes its methanol from coal. That is their primary carbon source. But, of course, they're putting out quite a bit of carbon dioxide in the process. For every molecule of methanol they make, they put 2 molecules of CO2 into the atmosphere. So this is a big issue. But China apparently also has quite a bit of shale properties, and they're unable to exploit shale because they have not much water. But there is a process called dry fracking. Dry
CO2.
fracking, CO2 fracking. CO2 fracking is a process which China could adopt to get shale gas out. That way they could be much more, environmentally benign in making their methanol. So that's something, I don't know, maybe Chinese could adopt, and we could teach them how to do, shale gas fracking using CO2.
Do you see that happening, Vic?
CO2 fracking is still in early stages. I wouldn't say that it's at a point where we know it's economical. I would like it to be, but it's in early stages. But I think what China can do is to use brackish water. It is completely feasible to use salty water, and the salty water which cannot be used for anything else. Sichuan has a problem with fresh water. Shell is there as well with working with the Chinese. You don't need fresh water. So flat out statement, you do not need fresh water to produce shale gas. And so one of the things we can do is work with China on transferring that technology. Completely feasible.
If we look at the brackish water versus freshwater story, that would really undermine one of the big objections that some local and environmental groups are pushing against shale development in the U.S. as well.
It will, but for a number of reasons, industry tends to be recalcitrant about using new technology like that. I mean, it's completely feasible, but you ask, why isn't everybody doing it? Some people are. Apache is doing it. It's sometimes because the industry tends to do what's easy. And right now you can go to a farmer and pay him a little more for the water and get fresh water. So if you can get it, why wouldn't you is the deal. The fact is that we should all switch to brackish water.
What do you say about that?
Wickrum's absolutely right. In fact, brackish water is being used a lot down in Texas. And actually going back to what I talked about in the Marcellus Shale, the reason why it's much cheaper now for them to get natural gas out of the ground is because they are using flowback water and produced water, which is brackish water. So the cost of fresh water is still fairly cheap. The cost of disposal of flowback and the produced water is very high. And the places where you can dispose of that is becoming harder and harder to find those places. So that's probably one of the biggest threats to that industry. But as they recycle more of their produced water and use more brackish water, that's what's causing some of the big changes in that industry.
That's where we get into a whole lot of side issues with the price of water is cheap to purchase, but is that the real price of water?
Right.
We look at a lot of places across the country and certainly across the world where people are not paying the real price of water, and especially if you're talking about the agricultural industry, way underpricing of water in some areas.
California has no water, and yet it actually wants more rice production.
Yes.
Technology and the market will determine what we do with fracking in China. There are already American companies over there, and if the market and technology can make a buck, they'll be there, as they will in Europe and elsewhere. Where you need a political contact is in this methanol certification, testing, determination of what the best fuels are. And what we need there is, we met with Ernie Moniz, and Gina McCarthy needs to be part of this. You need a group to contact cabinet level in China and say, let's do this thing together. It would be immensely valuable to the United States and the methanol industry, as well as to China. And the good thing to America, we want to reduce CO2. We could help China reduce its CO2 by more efficient engines in China.
You're seeing all this testing and certification work going on in China, going on elsewhere in the world. Why does the U.S. have to go and do it again from scratch? Why can't we pick up the information that other countries, especially China, have developed? What's the obstacle here?
Well, we don't know what they know at this point, and there are groups of provinces all over China. About half of China has different tests with different fuels, and you need to collate those facts, and maybe you have to have some new tests on whether or not it's caustic or toxic. Now, not everybody's convinced that it's safe, and I think we can prove that it is, but China is the test bed for doing that.
I seem to remember, Boyden, a story in which somebody, this is years back in the 90s, right? A reporter was challenging you on whether methanol was safe?
Yes, well, the story is, well, it wasn't, wasn't a reporter, it was, I hate to say it, but it was some members of the oil and gas industry who were saying, you know, methanol is toxic. And my answer to them was, well, the first thing they said was, if you continue to advocate for methanol, you're going to push up the price of natural gas. And I was then working for George Herbert Walker Bush, and I said to them, I go to bed every night, he goes to bed every night, praying that the price of natural gas will go up, and you're accusing me of doing something which might push up the price of natural gas. Well, then they said, well, methanol's toxic. And I said, well, you know, the dose is the poison. So is gasoline. And what I will do is I will promise to drink twice the volume of methanol of any volume of gasoline you will drink. And Mobil took out an ad in the Wall Street Journal and said, don't do it, Boynton.
Yes, Vic.
There's also the question of biodegradability. People say methanol is not biodegradable. Let me tell you a little bit of chemistry. Bugs like small molecules. Methanol would biodegrade much faster than gasoline. Well, I'll take a methanol spill anytime, any day than a gasoline spill, because bugs will eat small molecules. They will get rid of that methanol.
So
that's a nonsense discussion.
The Exxon Valdez, if it had been full of methanol, no story.
Oh, actually, there's a master's degree student at Columbia who's done that study. If that had been methanol, what would have been the result? Yes.
You know, methanol is already used in wastewater treatment. They use it in what is called denitrification of water. 300 tons is used in Los Angeles wastewater treatment. And also methanol, the bugs would eat it, make single cell proteins. And ICI had a company, they made 100,000 tons of edible proteins as animal feed, where methanol was the starting material, fed to the bugs.
I use it on my windshield.
Toxicity about methanol, methanol is toxic if you drink it, but you're already using methanol, your windshield wiper fluid. 30% is methanol. Whenever you switch on your windshield wiper, 30% is methanol. And methanol in small quantities, if you drink beer, you get some methanol, few ppm. Like Coke, Diet Coke, which has aspartame, makes methanol in your gut. Small amount is safe, small ppm amounts. And also methanol, you could add an additive called Bitrex. And the moment it touches your lip, it's very bitter, you won't drink it.
But I know you wanted to jump in here.
Just to reinforce something Senator Johnson said a moment ago about the value of learning from the experience of others, China specifically. And there is help coming from China, I think, because we have formed the Energy Security Council and China and Brazil, the Joint Alternative Fuels Alliance. Well, the University of Beijing is going to host the Secretariat for that. And our hope is to share best practices both in the development of shale gas and other things like that. But if you stop and think for a moment, what might be the impact of that kind of cooperation? Half of the automobiles on the planet are produced in those 3 countries. Well, what if China, before long, were to say that if you want to sell a car in China, it's got to be flex fuel, methanol flex fuel? Surely that would impact the BMW, Toyotas, Buicks, Chrysler, Ford, and all who are looking at the biggest market in the world. China makes 19 million cars annually, twice what we do every year. So that kind of cooperation, I think, will show benefits in what we will learn and in what the manufacturers will learn.
Now, I just want to draw out some of the recommendations that we talked about in that U.S. Energy Security Council report, Fuel Choice for American Prosperity. And we emphasized the prosperity point because, after all, if you're looking at building lots and lots of plants around the country or opening the market, so investors want to build lots and lots of plants around the country to compete against gasoline, to compete against diesel, that investment drives job creation, it drives tax revenue, it drives a lot of things that here in Washington people talk about constantly. Some of the recommendations that we spoke about had specifically to do with international cooperation. That's where that Jaffa recommendation came from. But specifically looking at the domestic recommendation, and we'll talk about this more in the later sessions, and Bud, if you could just kind of highlight this, an alternative to the open fuel standard, something that, you know, if some members of Congress say we don't want to do a mandate, we spoke about a different structure.
Well, instead of dictating that the industry has to produce half of its vehicles and ultimately 75% as flex fuel, since that simply won't pass, we've stepped back a moment and asked, well, what kind of challenge is the automobile industry facing today? A big one is the CAFE standard, fuel efficiency standard. 54 miles a gallon is a very, very tough threshold to reach. And if there were an incentive that, let's say, for example, you make half your cars flex fuel, methanol, ethanol, gasoline capable, you'll get a credit against reaching that. And pick a number, 3, 4, 5 miles per gallon, whatever it is. That is an enhancement that really does incentivize the industry to produce more flex fuel cars. That creates the market that the fuel makers are looking for, and for the investors who are looking for whether or not to invest or not, that market in numbers will be created.
So just to kind of, to draw the point, you're saying if at least half of the vehicles in your fleet in a year are fuel competitive vehicles, any type of technology, but if you're making them flex fuel, they have to be able to run on methanol too, then you're going to get a credit towards that top line CAFE number. Not a per vehicle credit, but a big, nice, 4 mile per gallon credit towards that whole number. And so that really drives the automakers to move a large portion of their fleet towards fuel competition, not just 1, 2, 3, 4 vehicles. Donna?
And on the consumer side, if the consumer were to get a credit in some way to be able to, for buying this vehicle, and if we could then draw out what the savings for that kind of consumer would be from spending, what equates to $100 oil at the gas pump to what they would be paying for this blend, then you see that would go back into the economy, because it's not just going to go back into the oil industry. So I think if you can also focus on how the trickle-down effect helps the overall employment, consumerism, and general population in a way that helps keep the economy vibrant with new sources.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, any famous last words? Vic, I see you want to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, my wish is that if this sort of measure goes through and we have E85/M85 pumps, then I would like some automaker to take that one leap, which is, say, a high compression engine that runs only on E85, M85, or methane. And once you have the pump and you have that engine, trust me, they'll all be buying that engine because it will be more efficient. Somebody mentioned that earlier.
Well, I really have to push back against that. And I have to point out, I have an article actually out on the table. I think it's really, really tempting for those of us that are focused on fuel competition to say, well, why don't go whole hog to the other end and forget gasoline altogether? I think that's really, really dangerous.
I'm only asking for a small portion of the fleet.
I'll tell you why.
Small portion of the fleet.
I'll tell you why I think it's dangerous. We have a lot to learn from the Brazilian example. If you remember, Brazil went from 100% gasoline cars to 100% ethanol cars. The price of sugar was low, the price of oil was high, everybody loved it. They only bought dedicated ethanol cars. Well, then the bottom fell out of the paradigm because oil price fell, sugar price went high, and they didn't want to buy these dedicated ethanol cars anymore. That's why fuel flexibility is so important, because you have a platform the consumer always wants. They always want that car because they can always choose the cheapest fuel.
We'll argue more.
The moderator's right to bully. Anything else you want to jump in before you wrap up the panel?
I just want to make one point on incentives.
Yes.
Incentives are great to get the market started and to get investment going. You have to be careful about having them long term. The market's going to have to be able to have market forces that drive the investment. You see what's going on right now in the biofuels industry. Getting an investment right now for biofuels is extremely difficult because the renewable fuel standards are under attack. So most of the investors in that market are looking at that and saying, let's just wait and see what happens. So getting incentives to get through some of those initial barriers so other fuels can catch up is great. We just need to make sure that we don't have those things going on for the next 20 years.
And make sure that the incentives are not subsidies or not requiring a particular fuel blend or anything like that, but rather removing obstacles, making a system more flexible so that automakers can say, you know what, this is actually a better way for us to meet our obligations. All right, with that, thank you very much to our panel.